Hi, I'm Natasha with Premier Risk Solutions, and this is our new video series, Strong, Safe, and True. It's designed to sit down with security experts like my friend Bill here, who I'm going to introduce in just a second. And we talk to you about how to make your company safer, how to give your employees tools to feel empowered in potentially volatile situations. And we're going to do this on a regular basis. Today, we're going to hit on domestic terrorism with Bill Cooper, retired police chief. You have a whole host of qualifications under your belt, Bill, so I'm going to let you describe them.
Thanks, Natasha. As Natasha says, I was a police officer for 30 years, retired as the chief of police. I was involved in major incidents. I commanded major incidents. When I retired, I was recruited to manage the Puget Sound region of corporate security for Microsoft. And then I managed all of corporate security for T-Mobile for 5 years. Part of those was I did major cases. For example, at T-Mobile, I built a threat assessment and management team. I built a workplace violence team, and we were handling workplace violence cases all the way from I don't like you to murders in the stores, robberies, murders in the stores. So I've got a wealth of experience. I've been doing threat assessments, threat managements, and it has been interesting, fascinating. I have been involved in terrorism cases. I have, since 9/11, been involved in developing terrorism response plans. So there's a lot. There's just a lot.
There is a lot, and this is timely, our issue, or our topic, I should say, of domestic terrorism, given that the shooting just happened in Colorado. Anytime I see an active shooter scenario, my hairs go up, because there always seem to be some sort of sign or indication it might happen, and then we continue to see incidents. So today we're talking about domestic terrorism in a more general capacity, not focusing on Colorado. And the very first topic is you believe there's going to be a projected increase in these incidents. Can you tell us why?
I do. There have been historic militias, historic domestic terrorism groups for decades. Because of 2020 specifically, you're going to see an increase in the number of these cases, the differing ideologies, the political environment, the race issues out here, and in many cases, the COVID restrictions and requirements, the lockdowns, are concerns that are driving more radicalization, more levels of violence. Militias are becoming more organized. They're collaborating together. They're proposing levels of violence that we haven't seen over the years. You're also going to see more small groups and lone offenders growing. They're also being trained, even from overseas, they're being trained as well. You are looking at them, they're building on momentum from the 2020 riots, the 2020 issues, and then 2021, the attack on the Capitol.
There are a range of militias. I think, looking at your list, both sides of the fence, right? It is a really tense climate right now. And talk a little bit about some of the organizations that we may not be aware of that could pose a threat to a business or company.
You're seeing more recent growth. For example, as you look at the list, you've got a new one called Citizens Liberty Organization, very violence oriented. You have white, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. You now have Black, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. You have the anarchists. They've been around for a long time. They're growing. You have a new one, and it's called the Not, and we'll insert a colorful metaphor here that starts with an F, the Not Around Coalition. You've got another one called the Crusader. But all of these are violence prone. They're planning violence. The level of violence is going up. You have other extremist groups in here as we look at tax protesters, gun rights activists, animal rights activists. Those are going to grow predicated on the political environment that's being proposed out here today.
Okay, and these organizations, It seems like, looking to your second point, they have more momentum under their wing, it seems like at the moment.
They do. You look at, those are the right wing elements. When we look at the left, you have, generally speaking, there's more causes, more beliefs that they have. There's more motivation for violence, as we saw in 2020. Basically speaking, they're opposed to capitalism. They support socialism. They have their environmental issues. They have animal rights issues. They have the anarchist agendas. They're into the social justice. They're anti-law enforcement, anti-criminal justice. And we've seen largely what they're capable of in 2020. And that was an entire year of riots, damage, death, destruction, and not a lot of consequence for it. So
right.
One of these organizations proposes violence. And in the militia area, for example, they're targeting government, they're targeting law enforcement, they're targeting first responders, religious organizations, such that. But basically speaking, a lot of them are now proposing ambush style attacks on first responders. And they continue to plan more attacks. So it's going to grow in 2021.
It's so disheartening to see this, especially given our line of work, like we are directly affiliated with law enforcement and ex-law enforcement. Okay, so the political considerations, and we've been talking about this, but with the climate being tense around the elections, was it fraud, was it not? What are some of the other issues really fueling, you know what I mean, besides the racial insensitivities as they're viewed? What are some of the other things on this list?
So largely speaking, the elections were considered fraudulent by a lot of people. There is a huge perception of government overreach, and you're actually seeing some of that. You're seeing more moves on gun control, especially after cases like Colorado. You're seeing the perception that we're losing the ability to have free speech. We can't say what the First Amendment provides for us. Religious freedom is perceptually, if not realistically, under attack. And then you've got the anti-law enforcement, the defund the police, the abolish police. That hasn't gone away. And when you look at cases out there where defunding of police, for example, Seattle, where they defunded the police significantly. They've lost almost 200 officers. Their response times are way up in emergency. And now they're proposing another $5+ million cut. So there's no consequence analysis. What are the consequences of doing these things? So it's just reaction to loud people.
Yeah. Well, and I dealt directly with some of these downtown businesses. And the question is, yes, I mean, they are losing property. They have no help. The police can't come because there aren't enough of them. And they're frustrated and wondering what to do. And we'll get to that. But I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of some of these attacks, because we always talk about being proactive instead of reactive, right? And the cost of doing something in the long run is much more efficient than the cost of not doing something. So let's talk about what stands to be lost if you're a victim of one of these attacks and you're not prepared.
You're seeing people lose their lives. People are being killed out here. You're seeing massive loss of property. For example, the riots in 2020 across the cities. The estimated cost is the highest estimated cost for riots in our history. That's estimated at greater than $2 billion, but it doesn't count lost income. It doesn't count lost property. It doesn't count injury and illness costs associated with that. It doesn't count insurance costs because the bulk of the small businesses don't have insurance, or they have limited
Right.
insurance. So it doesn't factor any of these things in. Business capability. Estimates run that in Washington State, 27% of the businesses are lost because of the riots. But when you look at the big one, what is the intent of a lot of these groups? Is to create fear, to create terror, and ideally drive working people home so that they can protect their families rather than protect their businesses. It's cost. The cost is enormous with this, and somebody's got to pay this. So
the question is, what do we do about it? how do we protect our companies, our employees, ourselves? What do we do about all of this?
It's a great question, because there's in many cases, a lack of information. There's a lack of knowledge about who these people are. Who are they? They're not just protesters in many cases. They're intent on damage and destruction. They're intent on modifying the country in many cases. Who are they? What are their ideologies? What are the potential targets? Because when we look at targeted, we're tying this back to the last one of these that we did with threat assessments. We look at how do they plan? A lot of them communicate using encrypted messaging. Okay. How do then, if we ask the question, how do we counter what's coming at us? So when we look at targeting, you're looking at a variety of locations, businesses. You saw that in 2020. A lot of businesses were, 1,500 businesses were destroyed. Government locations, you see that in Portland, you see that in Seattle. Religious facilities, you don't see a lot of it, but it's the religious attacks are growing as well. Large gatherings of people, that's been a long-standing one for terrorism. Symbolic locations. The bottom line.
On that, real quick, I want to interrupt you. So my question is, because everyone's been cooped up because of COVID, when that includes terrorists, right? So when we start gathering in masses again, do you look for like the active shooter scenario to be happening more often out of the gate because people are gathering again and now they have a targeted group again?
Yeah, you'll see it as stores open, schools open, you'll see that. And the other part of that we don't really talk too much about is there's a lack of consequence to these. You look at some of the district attorneys around the country won't charge a lot of these things. You look at the riots, they're charging, but not a lot.
Right.
So there's no consequences to these. So as we reopen, the risk goes up, not exponentially, but the risk will go up, which drives the need to do an assessment of your facility, your area, your operations, and your people.
And we certainly aren't, I'm not trying to scare people. I just want to make that clear. We're just talking about the realities of it, right? And it's always better to be prepared. And some of the things that they tell you, just personally when you're out and about is, if you see something, say something, right?
Exactly. It's not fear, it's not paranoia, it's simply awareness. And so in a security world, in your facility, whatever you do, is just be aware of what's going on. Be aware of the potential problem. And there's your risk assessment right there.
Right. And this all happened as a result of 9/11, to see something, say something, all of it. Like, this isn't going away. So I think it's really great that you're touching on, look, this isn't paranoia. This is our new normal. You have to be aware and you have to not be afraid to report something if it feels amiss. Because on the off chance, that 0.001% chance you're right, and there is something to it, you could potentially save lives. So it's worth maybe having an awkward conversation, if you will.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, when you look at the historic school shootings, the majority of those other students knew. They knew. They didn't report it because they didn't want to rat off a friend. They didn't want to be a snitch. That culture is changing, and it's changing a lot. And so you're starting to see people stand up now and say, no, this isn't right, and they'll report it. Who do they report it to? What is that the reporting? What do they do with that reporting? So it's simply a function of creating a process in your organization that allows people to say something, even anonymously, say something, and that it's taken realistically and investigated.
Well, I appreciate your time. And of course, we do offer assessments. And I'm going to be touching the next video after this one will be with Bill. And we're going to talk about these security and risk assessments. And again, it's better to be prepared in case you have one of these scenarios, have something in place, know what your company is capable of handling or not. Our main goal is not to push a service, it's to educate, because we really don't want to see lives lost. We don't want to see property loss. Like, it's so nice to talk to companies when they're proactive and I go, you're doing everything great. But, we want more of that. And that's where we can come in and kind of help. So here's my information. If you have any questions, Bill, Thanks again so much for being with me today. Always a pleasure. And to all of you, please stay strong, safe, and true, and tune in. I'm Natasha, and thank you.